This video is about some of the most important battles in the history of the modern Western world, dating back from the early 1500s to World War II. Now, obviously, I cannot include every single very important battle in the history of the modern Western world, but these are some of the battles that I think are the most important. I ended my last video with the most important battle of the Middle Ages in Europe with the fall of Constantinople, which marked the transition from the Middle Ages to the modern age. So I'm going to start off in 1521 at the Battle of Tenochtitlan. Keep in mind that at the time the Spanish had already discovered the Americas. They had taken over much of the Caribbean at this point and were exploring the mainland of what is now Mexico. The Spanish conquistadors under Hernando Cortés and their indigenous allies would eventually rise up against the Aztec Empire, led by Emperor Montezuma II. This was a decisive battle that resulted in the fall of the Aztec Empire after a prolonged siege. Cortés and his allies captured the capital city, which eventually became modern Mexico City. Now, to be fair to the Aztecs, they did put up a fierce fight, but the Spaniards had superior technology through the use of steel and gunpowder as well as cavalry, along with a lot of diseases, namely smallpox. And the Aztecs and their allies were eventually crushed. This would lead to the growth of the Spanish Empire and the foundations of what is now Mexico and much of Latin America, combining Iberian and indigenous cultures. And speaking of that mix, we now have to move to the Battle of Cajamarca in 1532. See, the Spanish already set up colonies in Panama at the time, or what is now Panama, and eventually found their way to the Pacific coast of South America. A conquistador by the name of Francisco Pizarro had led a fight, or more accurately, numerous fights and battles against the Incan Empire, the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere at the time. The Spanish only had around 200 men, in comparison to the far greater Incan forces. The main reason why the Incans lost so decisively, though, is because they lacked military know-how and technology. Sure, they were an advanced civilization, but they didn't have cavalry, as horses were not native to the Americas, and they didn't know how to resist Spanish horse charges. As a result, many of them fled, ran, and got mowed down. They also didn't have gunpowder or steel either, and they were also suffering through smallpox outbreaks, which is a disease that was ravaging much of what is now South America, even before the Spaniards made direct contact. This eventually led to the full-blown Spanish conquest of what is now Peru, much of the Andean region, and most of South America, except for Brazil and a few other countries that were taken over by the Portuguese and to a lesser extent, the Dutch, French, and British. Indigenous dominance was no longer the case. However, luck would not fare well for the Spaniards for much longer, as in 1588, the Spanish Armada would fight against the English Navy, or at least try to. After all, the Spaniards were Catholics, and the English had converted to Protestantism under Queen Elizabeth I. Well, more accurately, some of her predecessors. But she solidified Protestant rule. The Spanish Armada would eventually be defeated, not by the English necessarily, but rather by nature, as ocean storms crushed much of their navy. This paved the way for the British Empire's ascendancy over the Spaniards, in the Americas and abroad. Next on the list is a series of battles during the mid-1600s between the Ming Dynasty in China against the Dutch East India Trading Company. At the time, the Dutch had been on the ascendancy as another major colonial Protestant power from Western Europe that had set up trading shops in what is now Taiwan, this time through an actual corporation. However, the Ming Dynasty in China was not particularly fond of this, and they ordered the Dutch to surrender and vacate the island. However, the Dutch eventually defeated them. Keep in mind that this was quite groundbreaking. The Chinese had seen themselves as the center of civilization, the most advanced civilization that could thwart any sort of foreign ambitions. This was especially humiliating given that the Dutch East India Company wasn't even an empire, but a company. However, the Chinese would eventually have their way, but not for a while. Next on the list is one that I mentioned in a previous video, foreshadowing it, and that is the Battle of Vienna in 1683. This was between the Holy Roman Empire and the Polish forces on one hand against the Ottoman Turks. This was one of the most important battles of European history, quite similar to the Battle of Tours. After all, you had a major Muslim empire, the Ottomans in this case, setting siege to a major Christian city, in this case Vienna, in what is now Austria. With the help of the Poles, they defeated the Ottoman forces and marked an end to Ottoman expansion and Islamic expansion into Europe. This was seen as a turning point in which the Ottoman Empire would decline, and it would be the beginning of the end of Islamic imperialism and the rise of the Habsburgs' dominance over Central Europe. Next up is the Battle of Pacy, which I'm again mispronouncing, which occurred in 1757. This was between the British East India Company and the Bengali forces. The battle itself isn't particularly interesting when it comes to military tactics, however it's worth pointing out that the Indian subcontinent had some very intelligent and sophisticated leadership at the time. The Indian subcontinent had its own incredibly rich history, and to see it be defeated by a far-off rainy island far away was quite humiliating. This would set up the foundations of not only the British East India Company, but also the British colonial empire in India and beyond. Next on the list is the Battle of Rossbach, and I'm mispronouncing that. This was in 1757 when the Prussian forces under Frederick the Great defeated the French, Austrian, and Russian forces. It was a key battle in the 7 Years' War. The First World War, if you could really call it that, even though it predates the actual First World War. Frederick the Great achieved this remarkable victory against a much larger combined army. The battle not only showed off Frederick's brilliance, but also that of the Germanic forces, namely the Prussians, who were going to be the dominant force on the European continent. This would eventually set up the foundations of the rise of Germany itself. And now we move on to one that I think has been just done to death, so I barely want to really talk about it, and that's the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. This is quite possibly the most famous on the list. It's when Napoleon Bonaparte's French forces fought against a variety of allies of British, Dutch, and Prussians. This eventually led to one of the few defeats of Napoleon. In fact, it was the final defeat, and the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the downfall of the French Empire for a period of time. Eventually, much of the liberalism that Napoleon had spread had come to a halt as more aristocratic views came into prominence through the Council of Vienna, or more accurately, the Congress of Vienna, and the re-establishment of monarchical rule across much of Europe. However, this did provide a lot of leeway for the British to expand their empire and spread liberalism, as well as the conquest and imperialism throughout much of the world. So let's fast forward to 1942 and 1943 with the Battle of Stalingrad, arguably the bloodiest battle in human history between the Soviet Red Army and the Germans. I'm not going to mention what was the exact name of the Germans at this time because I don't want to get demonetized. Now, World War II is a war that needs no introduction. What we do know, and what most of you probably already know, is that this was a major turning point in the Eastern Front during World War II. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was, at the end of the day, a victory to prevent the Germans from moving towards the east on the road to Baku in Azerbaijan to gain access to oil and gas reserves, which was halted. The battle again was one of the deadliest in history, if not the deadliest, and the amount of human suffering was immense. What is so shocking about this ordeal is that you are pitting two of the most evil men fighting against each other, but you still want to root for one of the most evil men, Stalin, because after all, it was his country being invaded. Next on the list is the Battle of Midway. This was the decisive pivot point during the Pacific War between the United States and Australian forces versus Imperial Japan. Now, Midway is really just a kind of tiny island in the middle of the Pacific. It's really not even an island, it's an islet, and it was probably named by historians after the events of the battle. It's kind of interesting how an area so remote and so obscure had become a turning point in quite possibly the greatest war in human history. And during this battle, the US Navy managed to inflict irreparable damage to the Japanese fleet, sinking 4 aircraft carriers. Again, this marked the turning point of the Pacific War, shifting the balance of power to the Allies. And last on the list would be the Normandy invasion. This was between the Allied forces, mostly American, British, and Canadian, versus the Germans in northern France. At the time, the Soviet forces had already put the Germans on the run, pushing them out of much of Eastern Europe and verging on the border to what is now Germany. While the Soviets took the bulk of the brunt, the heroes and the soldiers fighting on the Western Front cannot be forgotten, and they would eventually move on to liberate France and kick out the Germans from much of Western Europe, successfully landing on a number of beaches before defeating the Germans once and for all with the help of the Soviets, who eventually would capture Berlin. And that's my incredibly brief incredibly oversimplified overview of some of the most important battles in the history of the modern Western world. If you have any other battles that you think are very important to Western history, or for that matter, battles that are important to other parts of the world, please tell me. Thanks for watching. Bye.